everyone, this is Aisia Tamasa, the first reporter of BSA-3A Group 1. So today we're going to talk about one of the important history of the Philippines, which is the Agrarian Reform.
Agrarian reform is essentially the rectification of the whole system of agriculture, an important aspect of the Philippine economy because nearly half of the population is employed in the agricultural sector and most citizens lived in the rural areas. It is also focused on the political and economic class character of the relations of production and distribution in farming and related enterprises and who this connect to the wider class structure. It simply means that this is the laws that were made that would give lands to our farmers, for they are the essential workers of our country and they are the one who feeds us. It is also an important remedy of the whole system of agriculture.
In short, agrarian reform is the importance of land ownership here in the Philippines with our farmers. With our topic today, we must always remember that land is equals to power, meaning the more land you have or the bigger land you have, the more powerful you are. It is because the owner has the power, the control, and the authority from the piece of land that he or she is handling.
So, in order for us to understand the agrarian reform here in the Philippines, let's turn our attention into our country's history, especially to the colonial past, where we could find the root of the agrarian whose the country has experiences up to this very day. Starting from the land ownership in the Philippines under the Spain, how it changes as the Americans colonized us, post-war interventions toward agrarian reform of the different presidential administration, where we can see the agrarian reform efforts under Marcos and the future of agrarian reform in the Philippines. In understanding deeper the agrarian reform, it all started in the land ownership in the Philippines under the Spain, for they are the first colonizers who taught us many things starting from our religion and as well as our farming systems. When the Spaniards colonized the country, they brought with them a system of pueblo agriculture. Pueblo agriculture, where rural communities, often dispersed and scattered in nature, were organized into a pueblo and given land to cultivate. Each Christianized native family is given a 4 to 5 hectares of land to cultivate. They were the tillers and workers of the land. Families are not allowed to own their land. The native families were merely landholders and not landowners. By law, the land assigned to them was the property of the Spanish king, where they paid their colonial tributes to the Spanish authorities in the form of agricultural products that they produced. Later on, through the law of the Indies, the Spanish crown awarded tracts of land to religious orders, repartimientos for Spanish military as reward for their service, and Spanish encomenderos, those mandated to manage the encomienda or lands given to them, where Filipinos worked and paid their tributes to the encomendero. It was really hard for the native Filipinos, for abusive encomenderos collected more tributes that became the land rentals from the natives living in the area. From this encomienda system, the hacienda system developed in the beginning of the 19th century as the Spanish government implemented policies that would fast-track the entry of the colony into the capitalist world. This is where the Spanish crown made a law in 1865 ordering landholders to register their land holdings. Ancestral lands were claimed and registered in other people's names, which is for Spanish officials or local chieftains, and as a result, many peasant families were driven out from the lands they have been cultivating for centuries or were even forced to become tillers. This is the primary reason why revolts in the Philippines were often agrarian in nature. Before the colonization, Filipinos had communal ownership of land. The system introduced by the Spaniards became a bitter source of hatred and discontent for the Filipinos. Those religious orders, the biggest landowners in the Philippines, also became a main source of abuse and exploitation for the Filipinos, increasing the rent paid by the Filipinos on a whim. Filipinos fought the Philippines Revolution in a confluence of motivations, but the greatest desire for freedom would be necessity of owning land. Upon the end of the Philippines Revolution, the revolutionary government would declare all large landed estates, especially the confiscated fire lands, as government property. However, the Philippine Republic was short-lived. The entrance of the Americans would signal a new era of colonialism and imperialism in the Philippines. When the native Filipinos are ready to stand up on their feet, another era of colonization is going to uproar.
Land ownership in the Philippines under the Americans. The American era started on 1898 to 1935. Realizing that being landless was the main cause of social unrest and revolt at that time, the Americans sought to put an end to the miserable condition of the tenant-tailors and small farmers by passing several land policies to widen the base of small land holdings and distribute land ownership among the greater number of Filipino tenants and farmers. So the first one is the Philippine Bill of 1902. This law provides regulations on the disposal of public lands, wherein a private individual can own 16 hectares of land, while a corporate land holdings can avail of 1,024 hectares. This also gave the rights of the American to own agricultural lands. So, by the Philippine Bill of 1902, Americans have the right to own lands in the Philippines, and that the public lands was disposed, wherein an individual can own 16 hectares. Some 400,000 native farmers were without titles at the start of the American era. This situation was also aggravated by the absence of records of issued titles and accurate land surveys. To remedy the situation, the torrent system was then introduced to replace the registration system implemented by the Spaniards. So, at the start of the American period, there are 400,000 native farmers that doesn't have land titles. So, this situation was aggravated or rise because of the absence of records. So, lacking of records of the titles given, then accurate land surveys. The next was the Homestead Program of 1903. This program allowed an enterprising tenant to acquire a farm of at least 16 hectares to cultivate. However, the program was not implemented nationwide and was introduced only in some parts of Mindanao and northern Luzon, where there were available public, alienable, and disposable lands. So the homestead program was not widely used in the Philippines. It was only introduced in the parts of Mindanao and northern Luzon. This is due to that in parts of Mindanao and Luzon, there are available public and disposable lands. Then homestead program is the allowed enterprising tenant to use at least 16 hectares of land to cultivate. And next, there was no limit on the size of land holdings one could possess. Land holdings were once again concentrated in the hands of fewer individuals who can afford to buy, register, and acquire fixed titles of their properties. Hence, more lands were placed under tenancy. So, there were no limit on the size of land holdings one could possess. If and only if you could afford to buy, register, and acquire or get fixed titles of your land properties. So, due to that, more lands were still under tenancy and more farmers are only tenants. There were widespread peasant uprisings headed by the armed peasants. Headed by the armed peasants group known as the Kulurum and Sakdalista of Luzon and northeastern Mindanao, respectively. These uprisings resulted to social disorder in 1920s and 1930s. Hence, more militant peasants and workers organization banded together for a more collective action against the abuses of landlords and unjust land ownership situation. This gave birth to the Communist Party of the Philippines. So, due to the uneven selling of lands, there were the widespread of peasants like the Sakdalista and Kulurom from Luzon and northeastern Mindanao. So this made more militant peasants and worker organization banded together for abuse of landlords and unjust land ownership situation. Because that time, only those who could buy, register, and acquire fixed titles of their properties can own land. And next would be the Commonwealth years, 1935 to 1942. The government under the stewardship of President Quezon realized that land reform programs should be implemented immediately. They saw the purchase of prior lands as a possible way to solve the problem of inequitable land ownership. They also saw that the homestead program could be transformed into a massive resettlement program if properly implemented. And that would be all. Thank you.